Sometimes the ones who seek no company are the ones the wild chooses first. She lived alone in the woods until that morning. The sun had not yet fully crested the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and a gauzy mist clung to the trees, like a memory refusing to fade. The cabin sat quietly at the end of a gravel road, nestled deep into the woods near Highlands, North Carolina. It was the kind of place that GPS signals forgot, where the only constant was birdsong, and the wind itself seemed to whisper secrets. Inside that cabin lived a woman named Lila Emerson. She was 48 years old, though the wilderness had softened and hardened her all at once, making it difficult to pin down her age with a glance. Her silver-streaked brown hair was usually tied back in a loose braid, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who chopped her own firewood and kneaded her own bread. Her eyes, however, gray and still like river stone, gave away her truest quality. She noticed everything, and she never forgot anything that mattered. Lila hadn't always lived alone. There had been a time, years ago, when this same porch had held 2 chairs and 1 laughter-filled life. Her husband, Charlie, had died of pancreatic cancer 6 years earlier, and after the funeral, after the condolences faded like smoke, Lila did what no one expected. She vanished into the mountains. But she hadn't done it out of bitterness. No, she did it for the silence, for the healing, for the hope that something in nature could reach the places in her soul that people couldn't. And in many ways, it had. Her days moved with slow intention. Split firewood at dawn, tend to the herb garden at midday, sketch wildlife in the evening. Her drawings, detailed pencil studies of hawks, deer and foxes, were the only things she mailed into town. Once a month, she'd drive 30 minutes to the post office to send off a stack to a small nature magazine that published her work. The checks were modest, but enough. That morning, everything was still. The kind of stillness that makes a person stop mid-step, sensing that something invisible has shifted. Lila was sipping her first cup of black coffee, wrapped in a wool shawl, standing barefoot on the porch. Frost sparkled faintly along the edges of the railing. The air was sharp but not cruel. And then she heard it, a sound so faint, so out of place it made her freeze. It wasn't birdsong nor wind. It was crying. Not human, but small, trembling, fragile. She set her mug down slowly and followed the sound, her boots crunching lightly against the frost-covered wood. It was coming from beneath the porch, low and muffled, like something trying to stay hidden and alive at the same time. She knelt, her knees pressing into the cold planks, and carefully pulled aside a few loose boards near the edge. And there it was. A small bundle of damp fur curled so tightly against itself, it looked more like a shadow than a living creature. It flinched when it saw her. At first glance, it resembled a house cat, maybe a stray kitten that had gotten lost from a litter. But then, she saw the ears. They were sharp and angular, with black tufts at the tips, standing alert like tiny sentinels. Its paws were too broad for its frame, and the fur, though patchy from cold, bore the soft speckling of wild lineage. And the eyes, amber and glassy, held a fear so raw, it went straight to the hollow place behind her ribs. "A bobcat," she whispered, barely audible. It didn't run. It didn't growl. It just stared at her, as if it were trying to decide whether she was a threat or a miracle. Lila stayed perfectly still, lowering her body closer to the ground. She remembered her husband's voice then, telling her years ago during a camping trip, "You don't approach the wild. You let it come to you." Minutes passed. Then slowly she extended one hand, not to touch, but simply to offer. "Hey, little one," she murmured. "You're far from where you should be." The cub shifted slightly, a tremor passing through its small body. Its belly was sunken in, and the skin around its ribs tugged tightly against bone. It couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. No mother in sight. No tracks in the snow. Just this lone survivor, delivered to her door like some quiet test from the universe. She didn't call animal control. She didn't close the porch door. Instead, she went inside and returned moments later with a small bowl of warmed goat's milk and an old flannel towel. She placed them near the edge of the porch, then stepped back, letting the cub decide what came next. The line between the human and the wild had just blurred, and neither of them knew it yet, but neither of them would ever be the same. And as the morning light broke through the trees, illuminating the tiny creature as it inched toward the bowl, Lila whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, "You weren't meant to be here, but maybe I was meant to find you." Naming Rowan. The fire inside Lila's cabin crackled gently, casting golden light across the wooden floor. The bobcat cub was curled in a tight ball near the hearth, its body wrapped in the soft folds of an old wool sweater Lila had placed on the rug. Its sides rose and fell in shallow breaths, the small ribs still visible beneath its dusty, speckled fur. Lila watched from her rocking chair, motionless except for the steam rising from the mug in her hands. The decision to bring him in hadn't been conscious. It had been instinct, a quiet answer to a question the world had never spoken aloud. She'd cleaned him up gently with a warm, damp cloth, careful not to spook him. He hadn't fought. If anything, his silence was louder than fear. It was a silence she recognized. She had worn it herself for years. Now, as dawn rose and spilled its soft amber across the floorboards, she studied him more closely. His coat was tawny with faint black spots. His ears, so unmistakably bobcat, were tipped with little black tufts that flicked every time the fire popped. His paws were large and padded, a sure sign he'd grow into something strong. But it was the eyes that held her. They were wild, not feral, not panicked. Just ancient, like he'd seen the stars from places she'd never walk. She spoke softly, more to herself than to him. "You shouldn't be here, little prince." He stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Her eyes drifted to the stack of books near the fireplace, field guides, trail maps, journals. And then her gaze landed on the window just beyond the firelight, where a rowan tree stood bare in the frost. Its thin limbs reached skyward, defiant, even without leaves. "Rowan," she whispered. The name filled the room, like the first note of a song. A name rooted in the forest. Quiet, resilient, wild. He didn't react, but the name stayed. That day, she called a vet in Asheville she trusted, one who worked off record, mostly with injured wildlife. She didn't give specifics, just asked about feeding and hydration. The vet said goat's milk was fine for now, and small, frequent meals would help his system recover. But he wouldn't survive long without supervision. He needed care, warmth, stability. Lila hung up and looked at the cub, now barely stirring in his nest by the fire. "Well," she said aloud, "I suppose we'll figure this out." The hours that followed became an unspoken pact between them. She didn't touch him. Not yet. But she stayed close. Every few hours, she warmed milk in a tiny saucer and set it just within reach. The first time he drank, it was with hesitation, as though unsure whether to trust the bowl or his own hunger. He licked once, then paused. She held her breath. Then he drank more. The relief hit her like thunder, but she stayed silent, not wanting to break the spell. That night, she moved a small mattress in front of the fire. She didn't sleep in her bed. Instead, she lay near him, wrapped in quilts, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. The snow thickened outside. The mountain grew quiet. And in the stillness between sleep and wake, she reached for her sketchpad. With careful strokes, she began to draw him, the arc of his spine, the curve of his ears, the tension in his paws even as he slept. Not to document him, but to remember, because she knew even then he would not be hers forever. But for now, he was Rowan. And for now, this was home. Learning each other. The days began to blur, not from monotony, but from a rhythm that belonged entirely to the mountains. Snow blanketed the world in silence, muffling every sound but the creak of pine boughs and the occasional distant call of a crow. Lila's cabin became a sanctuary, not just from the cold but from everything else that had once defined her world. Rowan was still cautious. He moved like a ghost, quiet, quick, always watching. He never strayed far from the fire, but he no longer flinched when Lila entered the room. He watched her every move with those sharp amber eyes, studying her as if trying to understand what kind of creature she was. At first, she only spoke to him in fragments, soft greetings, observations, stories she hadn't told another soul in years. She would crouch near the hearth with her mug of tea and say things like, "Charlie used to call these storms the sky's way of starting over," or, "I never liked town much anyway. Too many people pretending they're not lonely." And Rowan listened. Not with understanding, perhaps, but with presence. It was enough. Each morning, she warmed his milk and placed a few small pieces of soft chicken near his blanket. He would wait until she turned away, before creeping forward, silent as a shadow. But by the end of the first week, she noticed something new. He didn't wait anymore. He began to eat while she sat nearby, tail twitching with caution, but no longer fear. That afternoon, she drew him again, this time mid-step, as he padded across the rug. She tried to capture the way his shoulders rolled with power, how every inch of him was born for survival. "You're not meant for captivity," she whispered, and somehow, she already knew what that meant. He wouldn't stay forever. Still, she let herself believe that maybe he would stay long enough. By the second week, Rowan had started exploring the cabin. He prowled behind furniture, sniffed at the firewood stack, even leapt silently onto the low window ledge to watch the snow fall. Sometimes, Lila would find him curled in the corner beside her old boots, his chin resting over his paws. The more he grew, the more she saw the wildness bloom in him. His legs lengthened, his back thickened. His eyes became sharper, his movements more calculated. The softness of the cub was being replaced by something primal. One night, while she sat on the floor reading by lantern light, Rowan approached her. Not cautiously, not hesitantly, but directly. He didn't climb into her lap. He didn't make a sound. He simply sat beside her and pressed his body gently against her arm. Lila didn't move. Her heart thudded like a drum in her chest, loud in the silence. She reached out slowly, letting her fingers hover inches from his shoulder. When he didn't pull away, she laid her hand softly on his back. His fur was warm, coarse, alive. He didn't flinch. Instead, he blinked slowly once and stayed there. It was a moment she didn't try to name. She just lived inside it. That night, Rowan slept by the fire as always. But Lila didn't lie on her mattress. She sat beside him for hours, legs crossed, sketchpad forgotten, eyes full of something like wonder. She'd once thought grief had hollowed her out. But now, with a wild creature resting beside her and winter wrapping around the cabin like a lullaby, she realized something had returned. Not joy, not yet, but a reason to stay awake. Tracks and whispers. By the start of February, Rowan had tripled in size. No longer the trembling creature who clung to life beneath Lila's porch. He now moved with the stealth and confidence of a born predator. His tawny coat shimmered with health, thickened by the cold, and the black tufts at the tips of his ears stood tall like little flags of defiance. His paws, once clumsy and too big for his legs, now carried him soundlessly from one end of the cabin to the other. But while Lila welcomed his growth, The mountain had begun to murmur. The first sign came in the form of a boot print, not hers, pressed into the muddy bank near the lower trail. Someone had walked too close to the edge of her land, far past the usual hunting lines. Then came the paw prints. Rowan had begun to roam farther. She never saw him leave. He moved like mist. But in the mornings, she would find the faint imprints of his passage along the frozen creek. She worried, but she didn't stop him. How could she? He was wild, and the wild doesn't belong in cages. The next time she drove into town, she could feel the shift before a word was even spoken. At the gas station, the attendant, usually friendly, barely met her eyes. At the feed store, whispers followed her like smoke. She caught bits and pieces as she moved between aisles. That must have seen it clear as day. Those ears, that tail. Not a cat, I'm telling you. That was no stray. Livestock getting spooked over on Dawson's Ridge. Something's watching at night. Lila kept her head down and left quickly. Back at the cabin, she found Rowan asleep in his usual place by the hearth, one paw twitching as he dreamed. She sat beside him and ran a hand along his back. "You've been seen, haven't you?" she whispered. Rowan stirred but didn't wake. Later that week, a pickup rumbled up her road uninvited. Rick Dawson. He stepped out slowly, taking his time, his boots crunching over frozen dirt. Mid-50s, broad-shouldered, bearded, with the kind of gaze that had interrogated more than one forest mystery. His land bordered hers on the east, and he rarely visited without a reason. Lila stood on her porch, arms folded. "Morning, Rick." He nodded, tugging his gloves off. "Something's been stalking my goat pens," he said plainly. "Left no blood, but they're spooked bad. And I've seen tracks." She stayed silent. "Not coyote," he continued. "Too round, too wide. I'd say bobcat, but bigger." She met his eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting," he said. "I'm warning." A long pause followed. The air between them was colder than the frost on the railing. Rick finally looked away, scanning the treetops. "Just saying," he added, voice lower now. "If someone's keeping something they shouldn't, might be time to let it go before someone else makes that decision for them." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck. The tires crunched over gravel, echoing into the trees until the sound disappeared altogether. Lila remained on the porch long after he left. Inside, Rowan watched her through the window, his gaze calm, unreadable. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "They're starting to see you." And the truth was, she wasn't sure what scared her more, that he might vanish into the forest one day, or that someone might try to take him away first. A law bigger than love. The knock came just after sunrise. 3 raps, firm, official, echoed across the wood of the cabin door. Lila was still in her flannel robe, coffee half drunk, when she opened it. 2 figures stood on her porch. The first was a tall man in a forest green jacket, with a North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission patch on the sleeve. The second was a younger woman, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a line of uncomfortable professionalism. "Ms. Emerson?" the man asked. She nodded. "I'm Officer Clark. This is Agent Rivera. We received a report from a neighboring property. A possible wildlife code violation involving a protected species, Lynx rufus. You mind if we ask a few questions?" Lila's heart thudded against her ribs. "Of course," she said, stepping aside. Inside, the fire had burned low, and Rowan, thank God, was nowhere in sight. They scanned the space quickly, eyes sharp but polite. Lila noted Clark's boots tracking melted snow across her rug and forced herself to stay calm. "We've had several sightings reported," Rivera began, glancing at her clipboard. "A juvenile bobcat, roughly 20 to 25 pounds, seen repeatedly on private land. Multiple prints near livestock pens. Unusual behavior. Lack of fear around humans. Clark cut in. Softer now. And based on the proximity, we're obligated to confirm it's not being harbored. The word hung in the air like smoke. Lila kept her face neutral. You think I'm keeping a bobcat in my living room? Rivera didn't answer. Instead, Clark took a slow step toward the fireplace, crouching near the stack of firewood. I don't suppose you've noticed anything unusual, ma'am. Lila's voice was even. I live in the mountains. The unusual is the usual out here. Clark straightened up and looked her in the eye. He wasn't unkind, but he was firm. If there's a juvenile bobcat in the area, it's not safe for you or him. If it's being raised without proper wildlife permits, the penalties are severe. Removal, relocation, sometimes euthanasia if reintegration isn't possible. That word struck like a knife. Euthanasia. Lila's hands gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. I haven't seen anything, she said. But if I do, I'll let you know. The officers exchanged a glance. Then Clark handed her a thin pamphlet. There's a number here. If he returns, you call it. We'll send trained relocation specialists, safest for everyone. They left without another word. The silence after the door shut was heavier than anything they'd brought with them. Lila sank into her chair, staring at the spot where Clark had stood. On the floor, just beside the hearth, a single paw print remained faintly outlined in ash. She rose slowly, walked to the window, and looked out toward the tree line. And there he was. Rowan, sitting perfectly still, half-shadowed by pine needles and morning fog. He didn't move, just stared, not afraid, not hiding, just watching. She pressed a hand to the glass, whispering more to herself than to him. They know. He flicked his ear, as if he'd heard. Then, like mist dissolving into air, he turned and padded back into the woods. That night, Lila didn't light the fire. She didn't sleep. She sat at her drawing table instead, sketching by lantern light. She drew him the way he'd looked that morning. Tall, lean, half wild, caught forever between two worlds, neither one his own. She didn't know if he'd come back. But deep down, she feared the truth wasn't that he might disappear. It was that the world would never let something that wild stay where it was loved. Winter's silence. The snow came heavier than usual that March. Thick, wet flakes fell for 3 days straight, blanketing the Blue Ridge forest in a hush so deep it seemed to swallow every sound. Branches drooped under the weight of it, and the creek behind Lila's cabin froze at the edges, murmuring beneath a crust of ice. Rowan did not return. Not the next morning, not that night, not all that week. At first, Lila told herself he was fine, tracking rabbits, learning to stalk, becoming what he was always meant to be. But as the days dragged on, doubt crept in like frost through an open window. She still left the food out. Raw chicken scraps, a bowl of water warmed slightly from the stove. She set them at the edge of the porch, just under the overhang, where the snow couldn't reach. Some mornings the meat would be gone. But whether it was Rowan or a fox or a raccoon, she didn't know. That not knowing was the hardest part. The cabin had never felt so quiet. Even during her loneliest years, Lila had filled her space with the sounds of a life. The creak of her chair, the scratch of pencils, the pages of books turning slowly in her hands. But now, the stillness stretched too wide. Her pencils sat untouched, her fireplace cold more often than not. And the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow, empty in a way that made the walls feel farther apart than they were. She started walking more, trails she hadn't used in years, boots crunching over snowpack, breath misting in front of her like smoke. She followed paw prints when she found them, even when she knew they didn't belong to him. She needed the motion, the illusion of pursuit. One afternoon, she found herself deeper in the forest than usual, standing by a small rock outcropping where snow had gathered thickly. She crouched, brushed it away with her gloved hand, and stared. A print, wide, round, heavy, still fresh enough to hold its shape. Her heart stuttered. She scanned the woods, her eyes searching for any movement among the firs. "Rowan!" she whispered, the name catching on her lips. But only the trees answered, their limbs groaning softly beneath the snow. That night, she sat on the cabin steps with her coat drawn tight and a blanket wrapped around her legs. The temperature was in the low 20s, the kind of cold that cut through bone if you stayed still too long. But she didn't care. She needed to be outside, in case. Every rustle in the woods, every crunch of snow, every flicker of shadow pulled her eyes to the tree line. But no Rowan, not yet. By midnight, the moon was high and silver, painting the snow in blue light. She rose stiffly, feet numb, and turned to go inside when she heard it. A distant cry. Not a house cat's meow, not a fox yip. A long, low, yowling call, laced with loneliness and something else. Recognition. Her breath caught in her chest. She stepped down off the porch into the knee-deep snow, turning toward the trees, searching for movement. But there was only darkness between the trunks. Still, her heart beat faster. She whispered again, "Rowan." But the woods had gone silent. The sound didn't come again. She waited 5 more minutes, then 10. Eventually she turned back toward the porch, every footstep slower than the one before. She didn't know if it had been him, but somehow she believed it was. And that belief, as thin and fragile as a winter branch, was enough to get her through the night. At the tree line. The wind was sharp and dry the morning he returned. Lila had been chopping kindling behind the cabin when she felt it first, an ache in her chest, subtle but sudden, like breath pulled too deep. She paused, axe frozen mid-swing, and turned toward the ridge behind the tree line. Something was watching her. She didn't see him at first, not right away. The landscape had turned into a patchwork of melting snow and exposed earth, and the shadows played tricks on her eyes. But then he moved, just slightly, and her breath caught. Rowan. He stood at the edge of the woods, half-shadowed beneath a birch tree, his tawny coat speckled with snow, his body leaner, stronger. He was no longer the cub she'd wrapped in an old sweater. He was bigger now, easily over 30 pounds, with muscle rippling beneath his fur and a confidence in his stance that hadn't been there before. But his eyes hadn't changed. Amber, still watching her. Lila let the axe fall softly into the snow. She didn't move closer. Instead, she crouched where she was and waited. Rowan stepped forward once, then again, the snow crunching beneath his paws in slow, deliberate rhythm. He didn't sprint. He didn't stalk. He walked, not like a predator, but like something returning to a memory. 10 feet, then 5, then 1. Lila lowered herself to her knees, tears already slipping past her lashes, and extended a hand. Not to reach for him, but to offer it. A silent gesture, familiar, trusted. Rowan paused, nose twitching as he leaned in. And then, gently, so gently she barely felt it, he pressed his nose to her fingers. The contact was brief. A breath, a heartbeat, but it was everything. He pulled back almost instantly, looking up at her one final time, before stepping backward, turning, and slipping into the trees again like smoke on the wind. She didn't follow. She couldn't. She knew, down to her bones, that he had come back not to stay, but to say goodbye. The kind of goodbye only the wild could give, one without words, without promises, without the illusion of forever. Just presence, just return, and then release. Lila sat there for a long time, knees in the snow, her hand still lifted slightly in the empty space he'd left behind. The cold no longer stung. The silence no longer scared her. He had remembered. That was what mattered. When she finally rose and walked back to the cabin, she didn't cry. She didn't collapse with grief or reach for old sketches. She made tea. She warmed her hands by the fire, and she smiled. Because even if he never came back again, he had once. And when he did, he knew where home was. The photo. It wasn't Lila who broke the silence. It was a teenager with a camera. Just a week after Rowan's return, a 17-year-old boy named Caleb Morgan had been hiking along the upper ridge with his dad's old Canon DSLR. He liked photography, mostly landscapes, abandoned cabins, the way light filtered through snow-laced branches. He wasn't looking for anything that day. But the photo found him. From across the ridge, Caleb spotted the cabin tucked beneath the slope. Smoke coiled gently from the chimney, and on the edge of the clearing, at the tree line near the eastern side of the property, stood a figure. Not human. Not quite feline either. It stood still, completely alert, facing the cabin like a guardian carved from frost and breath. Caleb zoomed in and snapped the photo. He didn't know what it was, only that it didn't look like anything else he'd seen before. Later that night, sitting at his kitchen table, he uploaded the picture to his Instagram page with a vague caption. Saw this weird cat outside that lady's cabin in Highlands. Big. Real big. The internet did the rest. Within 12 hours, the photo had been shared across hiking forums, animal tracking groups, and even a regional news outlet. The hashtags exploded: #wild bobcat, #cabin cat, #Appalachian ghost. By day 2, reporters started calling, and by day 3, they started showing up. Lila heard the first vehicle long before it reached her cabin, the low whine of tires spinning on partially frozen dirt, the unnatural rhythm of voices speaking too loudly in the forest. She didn't answer the door, but they didn't need her to. One local journalist, a woman in her 30s named Dana Hodge, managed to get close enough to the cabin with a zoom lens and published a new photo, one of Lila standing barefoot on her porch, looking toward the trees with her hand raised, as if expecting someone. The headline read, "The Woman Who Called the Wild. Did a North Carolina hermit raise a bobcat cub in secret?" The flood came fast after that. Some articles praised her. Others accused her. Wildlife officials issued a cautious statement. No confirmation has been made of any illegal harboring activity, but the public is reminded that bobcats are protected under state regulation. People came to gawk. Tourists tried to hike her property lines. Someone left a note on her gate. "He belongs to the woods, not to you." Lila said nothing. She refused interviews, turned off her generator, didn't answer her landline. But inside, she saw the photo. A neighbor had printed it, left it folded in her mailbox. She recognized him instantly. Rowan, standing tall, watching, waiting. He had been looking at her window, not the forest, not the road, her. And in that realization, in that still, powerful image, something shifted inside her. Not grief, not loss. Clarity. She had never tried to possess him. She'd only offered refuge. The world might misunderstand that, but she didn't need them to understand. She only needed him to know he had been safe here. And by the look in his eyes in that photo, he did. The woman and the wild. The media frenzy passed, as all storms do. The trucks stopped rumbling up her road. The questions ceased. The posts faded from trending tabs. Rowan disappeared back into legend. No confirmed sightings, no official charges, no follow-up statements from the state. And Lila was left with silence again. But it was a different silence now. It wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of meaning, of something untamed that had touched her life and changed it forever. She returned to her drawings first. For weeks she poured herself into sketch after sketch. Rowan at the fire, Rowan crouched mid-step, Rowan staring out the window, eyes catching the light. But soon, the drawings became something more. They told a story, not just of the bobcat, but of grief, of healing, of what happens when the wild chooses to sit beside you, even for a little while. She gathered her sketches, her journals, her photos, yes, even the one taken by that teenage boy, and compiled them into a book. She called it The Silent Bond. No agent, no publishing house. Just a quiet print run, self-funded. And yet, it reached people. Animal lovers, grievers, veterans, widows, naturalists, children. People who had lost and found and learned to love something wild in their own way. The money wasn't enormous, but it was enough. Enough to start something she'd only dared to dream of in those long, quiet hours by the fire. At the edge of her land, she cleared space near the old trailhead and built a modest wooden structure, a wildlife observation shelter and education cabin. She called it Rowan's Watch. It wasn't much. A few benches, large windows, laminated maps and prints of her illustrations lining the walls. But it gave something back. Children came to learn about the animals who shared their mountains. Hikers stopped to rest and read. Volunteers helped track sightings of local bobcats, foxes, and even black bears. All documented in a growing logbook Lila kept beneath the counter. She never claimed ownership of Rowan, never told the full story in interviews. But those who visited the shelter knew, and they felt it, especially when they looked at the final sketch framed on the far wall. Rowan, sleeping beside a fire, one paw stretched out, head resting lightly over folded legs, his eyes closed in absolute peace. Beneath the sketch, in soft script, were the words, "He was never mine. I was simply his shelter." Years passed, and every now and then, Lila would wake early and sit on her porch, coffee warming her hands as the sun spilled over the mountains. She'd watch the tree line, quiet and still, and sometimes, just sometimes, she'd swear she saw movement in the brush, a flicker of an ear, a low silhouette slipping between trees. She never followed. She didn't need to, because she understood now. The wild comes back not in body but in memory, in meaning, in the echo it leaves inside the heart. And she would carry that echo until her final breath. Rowan had once been a secret. Now, he was a legacy, not caged, not lost, just free and unforgettable. In a world that often rushes to tame, label, and contain everything it touches, Rowan and Lila's story reminds us of something vital. Not everything wild is dangerous, and not all love requires possession. Sometimes the most powerful bonds are the ones we never try to hold too tightly. This tale speaks to anyone who has ever lost something, only to find healing in the most unexpected place. It teaches us that trust is earned in silence, that love doesn't always look like what we expect, and that letting go can sometimes be the most profound form of care. If this story touched your heart, and you believe in the quiet power of connection between humans and animals, grief and healing, solitude and meaning, then we invite you to join us here at Paw Prints and Stories. We share not just tales, but truths that echo in fur, footprints, and memory. And before you leave, here's a challenge. Look around your life. What wild, beautiful thing are you being called to protect, not to keep, but to shelter?